Here's a question that has stumped experts for decades. Why has Nigeria, a nation that by all accounts should have fractured, not only survived, but endured? Well, one researcher, Joel Livingstone, dedicated his life to finding an answer. So today, let's dive into his incredible journey to understand the hidden forces holding one of Africa's most complex nations together.
And that right there is the central mystery. I mean, you look at its history, civil war, military coups, deep internal divisions, and conventional wisdom says Nigeria should have fallen apart ages ago. But it hasn't. The real question, though, isn't just how it survived. It's how it endured. And that, according to Livingstone, is the crucial distinction. He says, look, survival is just barely hanging on. Endurance? That implies something much deeper, a kind of resilience with powerful roots that go way beyond politics or economics. And this one idea, this single thought, frames his entire quest.
So where does a quest like this even begin? Well, it's not in a library or a university lecture hall. For Livingstone, the final, most intense phase of his research started in a moment of profound personal silence. Back in November 2015, Livingstone lost his wife, and in the grief that followed, he describes receiving what he calls a divine commission. It wasn't a call to retreat from the world, but a really clear instruction to begin a new kind of research. And by 2017, this had launched him and his 3 children on an absolutely epic 7-year expedition. And his mission was incredibly specific. He set out to follow the footsteps of a legendary historical figure known as Simeon the Niger. Livingstone was convinced that by tracing this man's ancient trails, he would find the key to understanding the prophetic and spiritual mandate that he believes underpins Nigeria's very existence.
This personal mission kicked off one of the most unconventional research journeys you can possibly imagine. This was no typical academic field trip, not by a long shot. This was a 7-year total immersion into the very soul of a region.
The path itself tells a story. He went from the coastal winds of Senegal and the heavy, heavy history of Gorée Island, deep inland. He traversed sacred highlands that have shaped prophets for centuries, crossed the vast Sahel, and followed the great Niger River all the way from its confluence at Lokoja down to the delta. This was a journey through foundational, almost mythical landscapes.
And Livingstone's method was just as unconventional as his mission. He went so far beyond textbooks. He sat with griots, the oral historians who are literally West Africa's living libraries. He studied fragile ancient manuscripts and recorded histories that only exist in memory. And, crucially, his 3 children were right there with him, not just watching, but actively inheriting this deep, deep knowledge.
And this quote just captures it perfectly. He wasn't simply digging for historical facts. The whole journey was a purposeful, spiritual pilgrimage, dedicated to uncovering what he calls a divine design that's woven right into the fabric of the nation. All right, so after 7 years of walking and listening and searching, what did he find? This is the turning point. This is where all those threads, history, spirituality, personal journey, they all come together to form an answer. His conclusion is, well, it's radical. He argues that underneath all the surface chaos we see, the political turmoil, the corruption, the economic challenges, there is a functional, operational, divine design. It's not just some poetic idea for him. He sees it as a real, active system that ensures Nigeria's endurance. Now, he calls the core of this design the spiritual intelligence quantum. And the key point here is that for Livingstone, a nation's collective prayer and faith are not metaphorical. He argues they are a real, tangible, structural force, a functional component of national resilience that is actively shaping its destiny. And get this, that spiritual intelligence is just one of 9 distinct dimensions he identified. These cover everything from culture to innovation, but it's this spiritual dimension, he says, is the most overlooked. He believes that together, these 9 dimensions form this incredibly complex, interlocking structure that makes the nation fundamentally resilient. So, everything he discovered, this entire 7-year pilgrimage, it all culminates in 3 powerful, definitive statements. And he frames them not as his opinions, but as declarations of fact based on everything he found. The first is a declaration of purpose. He argues that Nigeria must not fall. And this isn't a plea. It's a statement about an unfulfilled role it has to play in the world. The second is a declaration of structure. Building on that first one, he argues that Nigeria cannot
fall. This speaks to that inherent, deeply embedded resilience that he spent 7 years uncovering. And finally, the third one is a declaration of destiny. He concludes that Nigeria will not fall, framing its endurance as basically a settled matter with global implications. So let's just break down the reasoning for a second. Nigeria must not fall because he believes it has this unfinished divine mandate to be a civilizational incubator. It cannot fall because its very foundations are reinforced by that convergence of intelligences we just talked about. And it will not fall because its endurance serves as a beacon for Africa and the global south, which makes its survival, as he puts it, a world question. You see, ultimately, Livingston's trilogy isn't just an academic text. He presents it as a testimony, the direct result of a personal encounter with the living, breathing, spiritual pulse of a nation. And Livingstone captures this feeling with this one really powerful final image. He describes watching a sunset over the Niger River and seeing the complex pattern he'd spent years tracing become, just for a moment, totally visible. He saw the river itself as this perfect symbol of the nation's millennia-long flow of trade, prophecy, and resilience. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Livingstone's work really challenges us to look beyond the headlines and the spreadsheets. It asks us to consider a pretty radical idea that maybe, just maybe, a nation's destiny is written in a language that politics and economics alone can't read. All right, let's dive right in. We're going to be looking at a really fascinating book trilogy called The Divine Mandate of the Nigerian Destiny. And today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to push aside all the usual political and economic analysis to explore a purely spiritual explanation for why one of the world's most complex nations is still standing. And this is the central question, isn't it? I mean, you look at Nigeria's history. We're talking decades of civil war, systemic corruption, and brutal insurgency. By all accounts, most analysts would have predicted a total collapse. But that just didn't happen. It's still here, and the author of the book we're exploring argues that its survival is the very key to a much, much deeper story. You know, the usual explanations always point to a mix of things. Political structures, maybe the economic cushion from its huge natural resources, or just the sheer complexity of its society holding it together. These are the standard textbook answers. But this is where the source material we're looking at takes a hard right turn. The author basically says that if you're only looking through those political and economic lenses, you are missing the most important piece of the entire puzzle. The real reason, the true anchor holding Nigeria together, is believed to be something else entirely, something spiritual. So who's making this claim? Well, that would be the author, Joe Livingstone. And according to the book's preface, he spent more than 45 years researching the spiritual dynamics that shape nations. His whole thesis isn't built on policy papers, but on a sense of divine purpose. And this is where you can really see the two worldviews side by side. Where conventional analysis sees a civil war, the author sees a struggle over a divine purpose. Where most of us see systemic corruption, the author points to a hidden spiritual architecture, almost like a divine blueprint for the nation. And those insurgencies, they aren't just random acts of violence. They're seen as direct attacks on a global assignment. It's a total reframing of cause and effect. So the book basically promises to pull back the curtain on all these big ideas. It claims it's going to reveal the specific divine plan for the nation, explain that spiritual foundation we just mentioned, and even detail Nigeria's supposed role in some much larger global design. Okay, but wait a minute. This raises a pretty obvious question, right? If Nigeria has this grand, divine destiny, then why is its history so full of chaos and crisis? Why all the constant turmoil? The author's answer is incredibly blunt, because significance attracts resistance. The thinking here is that all that struggle isn't a sign of failure. It's the exact opposite. It's actually proof of the nation's importance. The greater the destiny, the argument goes, the more ferocious the opposition. All right, let's get to the real heart of the trilogy's argument. It's all built around 3 very clear, very bold declarations about Nigeria's future. This is the core of the whole thesis. First up, the declaration is a statement of absolute necessity. Nigeria must not fall. It's framed as an imperative, something that is crucial for a much larger plan to even happen.
And why is it so crucial? Well, the book claims it's because her assignment is unfinished. The whole idea is that Nigeria has a specific, divine job to do on the world stage, and that mission is not yet complete. So its survival is essential for that to be fulfilled.
Then, the second declaration takes it a step further. It moves from what must happen to what is possible. The claim? Nigeria cannot fall. This isn't just a wish or a goal. It's presented as a hard fact.
And what makes it impossible? The book says it's because divine intent sustains her. And notice the shift here. It's subtle but really important. We've moved from a future mission to a present-day reality. The claim is that a higher power is actively holding the nation together right now, which makes its collapse impossible no matter how bad things get.
And finally, we get to the third and most definitive declaration of them all. It's a simple, powerful promise about the future. Nigeria will not fall.
And this final quote really brings the entire argument home. The author's ultimate point is that the nation's fate isn't actually in the hands of its politicians or its economists. It's already been decided by a higher throne. And in this view, that destiny is completely and totally unshakable. So you might think this is just a story about one country, right? Well, according to this book, that's not the case at all. The author argues that Nigeria's destiny has massive implications for the entire world. This quote really lays out the stakes. The author is claiming that Nigeria's stability, or its instability, sends ripples across Africa and beyond. Its success is positioned as a kind of key that could unlock major change on a continental scale. Now, the author makes a really important distinction here. They're saying this isn't just about simple patriotism or national pride. The term they use is prophetic alignment, which suggests this whole view is based on seeing how Nigeria fits into a pre-written divine schedule of global events. And this right here, this is the bedrock of the entire trilogy. From the author's perspective, nations don't just randomly pop up. They are intentionally created, raised to serve a specific divine purpose in a grand eternal plan. Everything else we've talked about really flows from this one core idea. And that brings us to who this book is actually for. It's not written for just anybody. It's aimed at a very specific audience. Leaders, intercessors, people who pray for others, thinkers, and discerning individuals all over the world. Basically, it's for people who are already open to looking at world events through this kind of spiritual lens. Which leads to the final, really thought-provoking idea the book leaves us with. It simply states that Nigeria stands as a sign. A sign of what? It doesn't say. So it leaves you with this one big question. If a nation can be more than just a country, if it can be a symbol, what exactly is Nigeria's story supposed to be telling the rest of the world?
You hear it all the time, right? The world is in chaos, facing all these huge problems that feel, impossible to solve. But what if we're not just failing to find the right answers? What if we're asking the wrong questions altogether? Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating framework called spiritual intelligence quantum. It argues that the root of all our global issues isn't political or economic. It's a failure of human alignment.
I mean, really think about that for a second. We pour trillions of dollars and just countless hours into tackling symptoms. But this whole idea asks us to hit pause and consider something pretty radical. Are all our efforts, all our resources completely focused on solving the wrong problems?
And once you start looking through that lens, you see the symptoms of that core misalignment everywhere. We seem to be completely trapped in these endless cycles of economic instability. You know the drill. The booms and busts just feel kind of inevitable.
At the exact same time, our planet is, it's practically screaming for help as these environmental crises just keep escalating, seemingly way beyond our control.
And then, when we look around for some guidance through all this mess, what do we find? A lot of the time, just a vacuum. There's this widespread feeling that our leaders are failing to give us any real purpose or direction. So you see, these aren't just separate issues. They're all tangled up together.
And that's really the central argument here. We're not just facing some long laundry list of unrelated problems. Nope, we're facing one single giant meta problem, a systemic, global failure of alignment.
And here's the kicker. If the core problem is different, it means our old tools just won't work. The conventional ways we think, the way we try to solve problems, they were never designed for the kind of complex, interconnected world we're living in right now. They're obsolete.
So, if the old way is broken, what's the alternative? This is where the framework introduces a completely new capacity that it says we have to develop. So let's define what it actually means by spiritual intelligence.
All right, Let's break this down. Spiritual intelligence quantum, or SIQ for short, is basically our ability to make decisions using more than just spreadsheets and logic. It's about accessing what the source calls transcendent guidance. You can think of it as a kind of deep intuition or a powerful connection to a bigger purpose. It's about having the moral clarity to know what the right thing to do is, and then having the insight to actually go and do it.
Now, this new capacity has 4 really key features. First, it's not just reactive, waiting for things to go wrong. It's proactive, helping us see problems coming. It also makes sure our actions are aligned with a deeper purpose. But this last one, this is what's really fascinating. It aims for quantum outcomes. This is the idea that just a few small but deeply aligned actions can create these disproportionately massive positive ripples of change.
You can see the contrast so clearly here. Conventional thinking is like a straight line of dominoes. It's reactive, it's siloed, and it's totally linear. But SIQ is much more like a living tree. It's both proactive and reactive. It's integrative instead of siloed, and its goal isn't just to knock over the next domino. It's to create those widespread systemic quantum outcomes.
So, if this is the new way of thinking, you're probably wondering, how does it actually work in the real world? Well, the framework presents SIQ as a new operating system for society. So let's take a look at how it suggests we tackle those big global crises we started with.
This slide draws a direct line from the problem to a completely reframed solution. So for social conflict, the answer isn't just about negotiations, it's about finding a shared moral and ethical common ground. For economic instability, it's about developing a kind of strategic foresight that goes way beyond the next quarter's profits. You see how it shifts the focus? It's all about moving from short-term fixes to long-term ethical foundations.
And here's the 4-step process for putting it all into action. It all starts with awareness. Actually seeing the ethical risks before they blow up in our faces. Then comes alignment, connecting every single action back to that higher purpose. The 3rd step is amplification, which is about using our most powerful tools, like AI, to scale up ethical solutions. And finally, a focus on impact, creating real structural change, not just slapping a Band-Aid on the problem and calling it a day.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. This can all sound pretty abstract, right? But the source material gives us a fascinating real-world example, pointing to Nigeria as a global model for how these ideas can actually be put into practice on a national scale.
The core idea driving Nigeria's approach is this powerful concept, a fusion of human, artificial, and what the source calls divine intelligence. In other words, it's all about combining our uniquely human creativity and empathy with the massive processing power of AI and the deep wisdom from our spiritual or ethical traditions. The goal? To build a much more resilient society.
So what can we actually learn from this example? Well, the key takeaways are about weaving morality and foresight directly into the DNA of how policy gets made. It's about empowering young people to drive innovation. And it's about recognizing that spiritual or community engagement, that isn't a soft skill. No, it's an absolutely critical tool for building national resilience.
And all of this brings us to the path forward. The argument here is crystal clear. Adopting this kind of aligned thinking isn't just a nice idea. It's being framed as a strategic imperative if we actually want to build a truly stable world.
And the source offers a pretty clear roadmap. It starts with embedding these SIQ frameworks directly into policy and how we respond to crises. It means we have to educate our leaders to think beyond short-term wins. And maybe most importantly, it means we need to start measuring our success with totally new metrics that go way beyond simple economic growth.
Ultimately, when you boil it all down, it comes back to this one central idea. Our global chaos isn't fundamentally a problem of logistics or politics or economics. At its very core, it is a failure of alignment.
And so we're left with this one question that just reframes everything. What if the greatest challenge we face, the one that's driving all the others, isn't about resources or technology at all, but is fundamentally spiritual? What if the real solution starts not out there, in the world, but right in here,